Congratulations. All right, family. So, you may or may not know that I came to the US when I was about 7 years old. Before that, I had spent, I was born in Lagos, so I spent like my first 5 years in Lagos, Nigeria. And then I spent the subsequent 2 years in, thank you, Tanaka, that's so sweet. I spent the subsequent 2 years in London, in the UK. So let's say a year and a half to 2 years. And then I came to the States with my dad and my brother, joined up with my mom and my stepdad, and we lived in Columbia, Missouri. And if you know anything about Columbia, Missouri, I'm gonna grab my strawberries. If you know anything about Columbia, Missouri, you'll know that it is a college town, University of Missouri. University of Missouri is kind of like the central economic engine of that town, right? And then there are like three other colleges. Stevens College, where a lot of celebrity actors went. Um, I have been to many countries, yes. Stevens College, Columbia College, and I think Moberly Community College might be the fourth, in addition to University of Missouri. So it was like very, very much a college town. And what's interesting about college towns is you have a lot of people who come there, especially immigrants, who come there on scholarships to study at the universities. Right, so University of Missouri was one of those places, especially in the 80s, that brought a lot of Africans, whether as, and when I say a lot, it's like, maybe three at a time for that type of place, right? And so I don't want to overemphasize, but, um, there were at least 3 to 5 solid Nigerian families who were in some way affiliated with University of Missouri, where I grew up. So anyway, we had a very small Nigerian community, but pretty consistent, right? We spent a lot of time, having like parties and celebrations and supporting each other, like special occasions in our journeys. I remember, I think the music's still kind of loud. I got to work on my sound. I know that the last video, the sound was a struggle, but yeah, we had a lot of like, I remember like pizza parties for the kids' birthdays. I remember, like play dates at the park. Very faintly that more so the play dates were like at people's houses, and probably it was like people were babysitting us for each other, right? Um, but yeah, we had a few family friends that we would go to their houses, and us kids would play together. The parents would hang out, or the parents would leave us and go do what they had to do, while our friends' parents watched us, right? Um, and then graduations and things like that. Ramadan sometimes. I do remember going to the mosque with my mom and some of my friends in the course of my time there. During Ramadan especially, and yeah, whatever other sort of like social interactions we could create amongst ourselves so that we could feel in community, we did. Um, and then very rarely us kids would end up in the same schools, right, with each other. And so, Nova asked if St. Louis. No, it's Columbia, Missouri is where I grew up. And then St. Louis is about an hour and a half from us, right? So St. Louis was like the big city from where we were sitting, right? And so having started my life in Lagos and having remembered the energy and the pulsating vibration of the big city, I definitely yearned for that again after living in Missouri. Columbia was much more quiet. It was very clean, very green, but very quiet. We did have some really interesting things, like there was a little bit of a hippie movement, Greenpeace movement. I remember meeting like some Rastafarian, like Americans who had sort of converted to Rastafarians, like Black Americans in like my high school time, I believe, high school, college. Um, and then just like little quirky things that happen in a college town where you have a lot of people who are intellectual. There's a film festival that happens there that my sister's a really big fan of. True False Film Festival. Let me know if you've heard of that or been there. I know Spike Lee has been there. I believe my sister might have attended a year when Spike Lee was there. But yeah, it's a really big festival that attracts a lot of like really dope filmmakers. Apparently, Ragtime Cinema might be where it is. Okay, so I'm sharing all this because in my work of liberating myself from within, rebuilding myself from within, as this techie shaman identity that I'm embracing now, um, I'm reviewing, my own experience to better understand how I have sort of graduated from different levels of understanding and wisdom, right? what in my experience has helped me to become more true to myself. And so a lot of times we talk about like Nigerian immigrants. I know that my research at Yale specifically started out from a position of trying to understand the trauma of Nigerian millennials, especially Nigerian Americans, right? And, so there tends to be a lot of blame put on the parents, right? Like our parents, you know, their particular style of child rearing is very distinct. Nigerian parents, like we know what it is that Nigerian youth have in common just based on the common experiences that we have with our parents. And so there was a very viral Father's Day skit that this creator posted on Instagram. I have to find his name, but I'm pretty sure I posted it to our stories on NordPress or something. Really, really great content. And I actually want to like break down the psychology in that. But one of the key things that came up when I was watching it, I mean, it was hilarious, but it was also like painful and triggering for a lot of us, right? And so I was thinking about what Dr. Nan, I guess he says about narcissistic abuse, right? And a lot of my work lately, especially talking about spiritual futurism, Black sacred futurity, a lot of my work is exploring like how our relationships, like how we liberate our relationships, how we liberate our intimacy, how we liberate our ability to like connect with one another, like deeply, authentically, consistently. And so what Nana Gessie does is help us to understand why and how a lot of our relationships have been traumatic, right? And this N word narcissist has become so popular in the last like 5 years, especially, right? 6 years. Everybody's a narcissist. Everybody's diagnosing somebody else as a narcissist, right? And when you come to really understand how narcissism affects its host or its target, you realize that this is something that is uber prevalent in society. That's why everybody can point to a narcissist, because it is extremely prevalent. And the reason something like that can be so prevalent in a society is because the culture of the society is upholding that behavior, right? Let me see what your recent comments. Yes, Tanova says trauma is passed down generations. Yes, 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 absolutely. Genetics. Thank you. Thank you. Um, trauma is, like you said, inherited genetically and also inherited like cosmically in a sense, like ethereally. So when I think about the cosmic, I like to focus on the good cosmic, like the positive of the cosmic. But the reality is the harm that many of us have faced is also kind of coded into the atmosphere and the stars. A lot of it is about evolution. A lot of it is about learning and evolving and becoming better and wiser and stronger and better human beings. And so um while you will hear me talk about the cosmic as like medicine, as our source for truth and healing and wisdom and vision, there is still an element in the cosmic or to the cosmic design that allows us to evolve through challenges, through some of this harm, right? The question of whether the divine intends the harm for our growth or whether, there is a polarity that is, contrary to the divine, that is up for conversation depending on what spiritual traditions we're engaging with. But at the end of the day, whichever way we understand it, um, you're borderline what, Tanova? Whichever way we understand it, the the cosmic contains good and evil, right? Joyful experiences and harmful experiences, right? We cannot deny. Some people will say like, the bad things that happen are not evil, they're predestined or they're supposed to happen or whatever. For me, I can't look at a lot of the harm that humans do to each other and not call it evil, right? I'm not evolved past that yet, if I'm supposed to, right? But um, the the material experience that we have in this generation contains both, right? Polarities. Um, and so when we are thinking about healing, we're taking stock of these polarities in our lives, right? We're taking stock of the experiences. We're taking stock of how we have moved through the good and the not so good, right? And in rebuilding the Black self, the opportunity to get to a place where you can see the benefit of the not so good as well as obviously appreciating and celebrating the good, and even the good, the tiniest good, right? The good doesn't always have to be like these huge things. Um, but our ability to evolve to a place where we see the benefit of all of it is a huge part of just growth in wisdom, right? And it helps us to be stronger just because we transition from fear and anger and upset over the challenges that we've had into an appreciation for the challenges, because we come to a place that we can recognize the benefit of the challenges, right? I'm going to play around with this light a little bit because I think it's a little bit harsh. So the goal being to reach a version of ourselves, to reach a a now, or a dimension, or an intuition, an alignment that allows us to exist as we are, one, and allows our core self to shine through, right? So I made a note earlier about, I was thinking about even calling this like the core self as the liberated self. And, the liberated self is a term I've used here and there. We probably, a lot of us have heard of the core self if we've done any sort of work on ourselves, healing our trauma. But as I continue to learn, like I said, like I'm doing my research in literature, like I talk about Fanon and Du Bois, I recognize that the core self is the version of ourselves that is untouched, right? That is um, undiluted, right? That is pure, is holy. Like when I think about holiness, I think about like untouched. For me, my paradigm is that goodness is the default, right? A lot of times the virus or the alternate way of seeing likes to make us think that, greed is good, evil is normal, right? Like that the default is evil, that people are inherently evil, right? Sin, nature, all that stuff. I don't really subscribe to that, and I see that there are definitely people in the world who may be inclined toward evil, and whether they are the same, sort of biological and spiritual makeup of those who default to being good, that remains to be seen. But at the end of the day, we have the opportunity to experience a default goodness. And I believe that that is core, at its core, that is tied to the spiritual, right? That is tied to the divine. That goodness comes from the divine. Goodness comes from the creator. Goodness comes from the origin, the source of breath of life, which I also define as love, right? I've talked about love being the glue that holds us together. So my experience is that this divine love is what is the sort of core matter, is the core identity, is the core material of human beings, of the soul, right? And so, if indeed that is the case, then when we get back to our core self, we should find love and goodness there. When we get back to our unadulterated self, when we get back to our never colonized self, the unabused self, that first self that we were when we came into the world, when we get back to that identity, we should experience it as love, as joy, as peace, as rest, right? If my hypothesis is correct, then that will be what we find when we come back to ourselves, when we come home to ourselves, when we deeply, intimately intertwine, align, return back to the core original self. We should find peace. We should find joy. Denova says she used to, or they, are you she, he, they? What is your binary or your non-binary? I used to always negative self-talk when young, but now I understand it was a big mistake. Well, most of us did, because again, unless you grow up in a culture that cultivates you to default to positive self-talk, it would be hard, you know, to default to positive self-talk, right? And of course, those cultures exist, you know, in the wild, indigenous, you know, cultures that were never adulterated by the virus. But among those who have been in Western environments for long, who have had our psyche and our language and our worldview and our minds shaped by the Western environment, we will naturally have a lot of negative self-talk, negative emotions, because we are existing in an environment in which the default aims to be, right? An environment that really pushes for the default to be evil, the default to be negative, the default to be harmful and painful, right? We are cultivated in the West to fear everything, right? To be afraid, to project fear, to be afraid of our own selves, to be afraid of each other, right? Fear is the key virus, the key element of the virus. And so when you are reprogrammed, reminded, you know, you have reinforced this idea of fear all the time. You express that fear against the people around you and against your very own reflection. Okay. And that fear manifests even within you, within your body, your being, your soul, right? This idea of a split consciousness that Du Bois and Fanon talked about is evidence of this separation, this fear, right? Because why would you be separated? Why would you be opposed why would these two sides of you be opposed to each other unless fear was in the picture, right? When we think about how the colonizer, the virus, came and made us separate from our core selves internally, intuitively, intellectually, organically, spiritually, right? The colonizer taught us not to see ourselves as the divine. The colonizer taught us to see ourselves as separate from the divine. Whereas if that is our original nature, if that is the source of our breath, how can we ever be separate from the divine? How is that even possible? How can that be a consideration? Yes, thank you for joining. I'd love to see y'all later when you come back. How can you truly ever be separate from the divine if you are of the divine? And some of you may not think that you're separate from the divine, but if, of course, I come from the Christian background. You know, I was born into a Muslim family. So I'm going to be talking about growing up Muslim as well. But if you are especially brought up in the Christian tradition, there is this idea that you have to come to God. You have to give your life to God, right? You have to become one of God's own, one of Christ's own, especially by, you know, repenting of your sins, denouncing your old ways, right? And becoming basically a member of the church, right? A member of the church body. And being a member of the church body comes with certain expectations and requirements, right? There's certain behaviors and beliefs and practices that are expected of you, right? And so that framing of, you know, being born in sin, being default, you know, your default is evil, but you need God to save you from your evil. That already inherently separates you from your heart. It separates you from your divinity. It creates a split within you, that there is good and evil within you, right? But it's flipped because it's basically telling you that the evil is the default as opposed to the good. And so you have to do all these things, all these external things. You have to take all these external actions. You have to practice and you know, believe all these external things in order to ever get, you know, get approved or, you know, get accepted into the kingdom of heaven, right? Let me eat a strawberry because I've been waiting for a minute to do this. Okay. Oh, praise the Lord. This is very nice and tart, sweet and tart. And so it's giving me a lot of like tankiness moving through, which is good. Wakens you up. Okay. So the big revelation this weekend was coming to an understanding of the type of identity that I was holding within as I place myself within my family. I'm gonna try my best to explain that, right? So I talked about migration early on. I, in my mother's family, which is the first family in my bloodline that I know of to move to the States, I was the first child of like this, the next generation, the millennial generation, basically the children of my maternal grandmother. Among the children of my maternal grandmother, my mother was the first to come to the States as an immigrant, like as a long-term immigrant. And thus, I being her firstborn, I was the oldest or the first of the younger generation to move to the States, right? And so naturally, because Africans move to the West for a better life, the expectation and the hope and the intention of a better life, a safer life, right? A life that protects you from the evil of empire as meted out in your home country in Africa. Because moving to the West comes with that promise, that is the priority when you get here, right? The priority is to make that better life, materialize that better life by any means, necessary, by any means possible. And thus moving to a place like the West, which is the land of milk and honey, as it was termed in those generations, moving here meant doing whatever you could to accumulate the material security that would allow you to, even when you went back home, if you ever chose to go back to your country, this material security would allow you to live well, right? To live comfortably, to live in safety, right? Again, we're talking about immigrants who primarily leave their home countries to pursue a more safe and secure life, right? A safety that has been taken from them, that has been disrupted by empire. So you come into this new world, you are working to achieve a more secure life, and the most important thing thus is money, right? Because you, especially if you're coming with minimal, if you come here with money, it's a different story. But if you're coming here with minimal resources, if you're coming here as somebody who a whole village had to put their resources together to send you overseas, then one, you have the heart debt, the responsibility of paying those people back, right? Not just materially by, paying back the flight cost and the accommodation costs, but also paying them back culturally, paying them back vocationally, right? Paying back in a way that you are able to share whatever your evolution and your growth and your wisdom that you've gained from moving abroad, you're able to share that back with them so they too can benefit from that knowledge, from that wisdom, from your experiences, right? And so thinking about my parents, their generation, and the folks who came to the US as one of the first like large groups of African immigrants, right? We know we had obviously the human trafficking, the MAFA, the start of the MAFA, human trafficking of Black African people that has never stopped in the last 500 years. We know that there was that current of slavery, but this, and that current of migration, but this current of migration that we're thinking about, um, in the late 60s, early 70s, we had a wave inspired by Biafra. In the 80s, after there were a lot of sort of changes to immigration policy in the US, and, obviously this was happening in the UK and across the West. But after a number of changes to immigration law, there was a huge wave of African immigrants that were able to come to the US in the 80s, right? And you can look at that wave as people who were often granted academic access to the US, whether they got scholarships to come and study at different universities in the US. Maybe they got, they were funded by an institution in their country, their government. Nigerian government, I know, was sponsoring folks at this time, right? Possibly they were sponsored by their government to come and gain some skills in the West and bring those skills back to their country, right? There's a lot of that in the 80s. And of course, it continues to happen. You have these skilled worker programs and all these things, right? And so you come here to study, you find some way to work, whether you have legal, permission as an immigrant to work and to make money or not. And if you have children, that complicates it even more, right? Because you have the responsibility of academics, you have the responsibility of working, you have a responsibility of child rearing, right? All all of which could be full-time jobs if you were just a regular human. But if you're Nigerian, it's light work, right? Supposedly. Um, so I want to lean into that question of Nigerian exceptionalism here, right? Because I said it's light work, supposedly, right? Nigerians are known for being very hardworking. Nigerians are known for being super educated. Nigerians are known for being the top of their class or the top of their industries, or leading and running all these major organizations. Nigerians are known as exceptional. Whether you're a founder, a manager, an artist, you're going to ultimately stand out or be expected to stand out because you have Nigerian heritage and Nigerian background. And a lot of this is due to this grittiness that we tend to share, especially among the class that migrates, right? A lot of this is due to that hunger for that better life that you came all the way over here for, that you left your familiar homeland, your familiar family, your familiar food. You left all of that to come into a whole new world that you know very little about. You have very little, if any, safety net. There's no family that you can depend on in this place. You might know like one distant relative in some other state that you were not able to even visit, right? You just stay in touch by phone, and these people give you advice, right? So all of these things that shape how you even get here and limit your access and your agency before you even get here, they also naturally influence how you operate, how you're able to complete your education, what kind of work you're able to get, and thus, of course, what type of parenting you have access to, right? I've talked on here about conscious parenting, and I may have said and touched on the idea that conscious parenting is a luxury, especially in the Black and Brown Global South community living in the West, right? The freedom to truly sit with your children and listen to them and teach them, that is based on the luxury of time, which an immigrant that has to work multiple jobs to survive doesn't often have that luxury, right? So the type of parenting that tends to be available to a Nigerian parent who comes to the West um, with minimal resources, minimal community, is minimal parenting, right? Like, you will do your best, but attention takes time, right? Giving your children the attention that conscious parenting requires, being able to sit with them and listen to them and observe them and analyze their behavior and analyze their thoughts, that takes the freedom of the time to do so. And that sort of freedom is rare in most immigrant families. And so when we observe these patterns of, you know, Nigerian parents, Chinese parents, Indian parents, right, tiger moms, immigrant parents in general, prioritizing for their children maximum success educationally, maximum educational success. When we see them prioritizing that over intimacy with their children, connection with their children, it is because, one, that form of intimacy with the child is a luxury, right? And two, many of them were not cultivated with that sort of intimacy, whether their parents had to work, even if they were in the country, right? Whether or not their parents had that luxury of time is always in question, right? Now we're thinking about polygamous households and all that, right? So looking at the luxury of time and how that defines, Prof. Anderson talks about time poverty, and a lot of scholars have talked about this, where, Black women, especially mothers, there's a lot of time poverty. And so the luxury to be able to sit there with your child, observe your child and teach your child, speak to your child, educate your child, question them, right? Like, these are luxuries that can't happen when you have to work around the clock. And so this generation of children, let me talk about Nigerian millennials especially, what you learned was that in order for you to get your parents' attention, in order for you to receive um, positive attention, or at least neutral attention, because oftentimes the only attention you got might have been from punishment, might have been from breaking a rule or not doing so well in school or whatever, right? And you knew that you needed to get attention, and so maybe you used those negative methods to get attention. Or you knew that to remain in their good graces, you just had to do well, right? You didn't want negative attention. You just wanted to keep the peace. And so you knew that you had to perform academically, and you had to do whatever, was required of you, especially in the household, right? So thinking about the firstborn Nigerian child, the firstborn daughter, especially, right? There are this collection of responsibilities where, academic performance is paramount. Respect for your elders, for your parents, and just obedience is paramount. And then if you have younger siblings, naturally, like the responsibility to look out for them, to educate them, to cultivate them, to push them forward, whatever. But even more so, to be an example for them, right? The responsibility of the firstborn to be an example is paramount, right? Because the expectation, and as your parents will tell you over and over, your siblings will do what you do, right? If you don't demonstrate a good example, then your siblings will follow a negative example, right? And so you have the responsibility of demonstrating positive example, how to. It was freezing. Your siblings know how to act. Let me just show disturbance. All right, but I'm just do not disturb. Yeah, so the responsibility of the elder is at minimum that, right? To provide an example for your siblings that will make them to make your parents happy, make your parents proud, right? Make your bloodline proud, make your grandparents proud, your ancestors proud, right? That is a very, very big part of what it means to be Nigerian and Nigerian American, especially, right? And so for me personally, being the oldest of seven, I didn't grow up with all six of my siblings, but I grew up with three of them. Um, I experienced that sort of responsibility, that awareness of responsibility, right? That not only are you the one who's going to like tangibly look out for your siblings, in the house, when y'all go play, when you're at school, whatever, you are also the one that's going to teach them how to act, behave in such a way that they too can learn, to behave well, right? And so I took this responsibility very seriously in many ways as a youth. However, the sort of direction, right, the sort of interpretation of being a good example, the interpretation that I had was very contrary to the interpretation that much of my community had, right? There are elements in my community of Nigerians growing up that had, they kind of agreed with me in terms of like liberation being paramount, right? And justice being paramount, and fairness and, egalitarianism, all these things. But the majority had only the capacity to focus on economic growth, right? Economic security. Um, what we call keeping up with the Joneses. I don't know if they say a Yoruba version of like keeping up with the Adebayos or keeping up with the Alakijas, like there is this aspiration to be among the best, right? This is what the culture requires when you live in Nigeria, when you are Nigerian. You are socialized to look upwards in society, to look at the people who have the respect, the visibility, the money, right? Those are the standards. Whether you're looking at Ovation, you're looking at the magazines, you're looking at the TV shows, you're looking at the news, you're looking at the billboards, you are being socialized to look up and to emulate up, right? That is your goal, is to be like the Alakijas, right? Have money, have an oil block, drive a Mercedes. Like if you know, if you know a Nigerian, raise your hand if you know a Nigerian who came to the States to buy a Mercedes. That was their number one goal, was to buy a Mercedes, ship it back home, and that was it, right? Um, and so if you weren't doing this, you weren't doing nothing. Because why? What else? What else could be important? How could you not be focused on getting, the nice car and the nice house? What else is important? And on a basic level, you understand this because it is a matter of economic security, right? We're talking about people who are looking for a means to stay secure. They're coming from environments and experiences that are very insecure, right? Unstable, whether it's housing, whether it's violence and, crime and robbery, whether it's food insecurity, right? Whether it's even like environmental insecurity with like terrible air. You're thinking about people who live in places like Makoko and, parts that they call the slums of Lagos or whatever, when all they would need is investment to keep it, livable, right? So uh, ultimately, you get the bottom line, right? People come over here for security. They don't have the capacity to do conscious or practice conscious parenting, the type of parenting that they have awareness of and place value in is that tiger mom parenting, right? And so the type of relationship that they then have with their children is more like that aggressive sports coach than it is the therapist, than it is the friend, than it is the nurturer, right? The cost of the tiger mom approach is that the nurturer, in most instances that we see, the nurturer tends to disappear or fall to the back, right? The nurturer in the parents, um, it just tends to be minimized, right? Because their responsibility as they came here, the intention they came here with was about securing your economic future, right? As an immigrant, as someone who comes from a place that is unsafe, economically insecure. We understand, right? And so part of that economic security has to do with immigration status, right, which we'll talk about over time. Um, but if we focus just on the economic security of the type of job that you do, you doing well in school means that you can major in pre-med, you can go to med school, right? You doing well in school, doing well in math, doing well in the sciences, means that you do have a possible opportunity to go and study, computer science, or you get enough good grades, you can go to school and get a scholarship, and you maybe could become a lawyer, right? Lawyer, doctor, engineer. We know what it is, right? Some people say lawyer, doctor, engineer, or failure. I would say lawyer, doctor, engineer, or free. And some people want to be lawyers, doctors, engineers from childhood, and that's wonderful, right? If you are the person who is wired in that way and you get to fit the mold more easily, lucky you, right? Because your joy is correlated with your parents' joy. You are inclined towards a vocation, towards a purpose, towards a career that can give you that economic security in this current structure, which then thus can give your parents that sort of, emotional security of knowing that their kids are going to be okay when they leave this planet, right? But when you are on the other category, the liberated category, the different category, I'm trying to think if there was a word that was flying into my mind. Yeah, you're just the alternate category. Then it introduces a lot of questions and struggles for that Tiger Mom model, because the Tiger Mom model does not understand why you would want to be economically insecure if you have an option not to be, right? The Tiger Mom model doesn't understand what paths you can take and what path you are taking to your own, like, future vision of your future. And so the Tiger Mom's approach to supporting you, it tends to be to help guide you back onto that Tiger Mom path, that lawyer, doctor, engineer path, because that's what they know. But the conscious parent who has the capacity, and that's like time, space, mental capacity, and even intellectual, spiritual capacity, the conscious parent pays attention to you, listens to you, studies you, tries to understand you as an individual, understand who you are, and what motivates you, and how you sort of make your decisions to move in the world the way that you do. And so the conscious parent who is equipped to support you then finds ways to equip you according to your unique path, right? When they recognize that when they're able to study you enough to understand what sort of path you're supposed to be on, then it becomes much more realistic. They can support you on that path, right? That they can actually look into people who have possibly gone a similar journey to you, and how did they find their fulfillment and liberation and freedom and success in this economic freedom, right? They can look into your intelligences and try to understand, like, what are your superpowers and how can you leverage those superpowers to be a blessing to others, and thus receive the the success, the reflective success that you deserve based on who you're meant to serve and how you're meant to serve them, right? um, the conscious parent can also even look to understand what makes you successful, right? Not everybody is built for the sort of 8 to 3 school model, get up, go, race, 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 compete, compete, compete. Some children are wired in such a way that they're going to excel in a different type of environment, a different type of learning approach, right? Conscious parenting gives you the capacity and the space to look at that and pay attention to that and try to understand, again, what does my child need, right? And so when you don't have that and you have the tiger mom parenting primarily, you have people who come into the world lacking nurture. Excuse me, they simply lack nurture. They simply lack an understanding of how it is to care for themselves, how to care for their heart. And when we talk about nurture, I'm talking about emotional nurturing, right? We can talk about nurture as like, food, shelter, clothing, all of that stuff, education. That is the tiger mom's approach to nurture. That is the type of nurture that the tiger mom can't provide. But the conscious parent um, is able to nurture your heart, all right, is able to pay attention to your emotional world, your psychological world, your spiritual world, and think about how to support you in your unique journey through your emotional, spiritual, like material, physical experience. And when we talk about it takes a village to raise a child, oftentimes it is not your direct parents who are able to give you that guidance. Oftentimes it's the uncles and aunts in the community, right? And so one of the key things that happens when African immigrants, Nigerians are displaced into the West is that you lose that extended family, that extended community, whether it's because of a lack of trust or it's because of a lack of actual population where you live, whether it's because you lack access to communities of people of your culture. Your children could then suffer the struggle of not having that village raise them, right? Only really being able to be guided by their direct parents or their teachers and or social workers or whoever kind of interacts with them in their life, right? As children. And if you're really lucky, your neighbors might be part of that, right? And so if the child is being socialized, what is being poured into that child is coming from people who are not of that child's original culture, in this example, Nigerian, then the cultural elements, the cultural intelligence, the vision that is being poured into that child is reflective of the community that raises them, right? And so if that community again is not Nigerian and that child, whatever percentage of Nigerian inculcation that child is getting, that is the percent that child will reflect that, that Nigerian culture versus whatever else is being projected onto them. And if you're in the Western environment, then obviously that is what you're receiving. So wrapping this up with how my breakthrough, how I came to understand like the identity that I was holding within my family versus the identity that I truly am. It was a process of looking at the challenges, right? Looking at the cycles, looking at the repeat challenges and analyzing like, what do they have in common, right? What is the core element that keeps showing up here? What is the thing that I don't like that keeps showing up here? And why is it still here, right? Listening to my subconscious, tapping into my somatic experiencing to notice what happens in my heart, in my mind, in my body when certain circumstances are before me or materializing, right? Interrogating those experiences to understand what is motivating them, right? And so we can get real deep into the nitty gritty. Join me on Substack, soulmedicine.substack. That's the best place I could tell you that we'll get into the nitty gritty. I've talked about having like an end of month event in July. If you're interested in, a communal event virtually for now, let me know. We'll be hosting some in-person spiritual events in the coming months and year. But yeah, if this is, medicine for you, if this is helpful for you, if this is like information that you find valuable, then I very much encourage you to join the Substack. I would also encourage you to join the Portal X community. If you go to portalx.space, you can scroll down to the bottom, click on community, join us on the WhatsApp. The temple is a place where we'll be sharing more of these like spiritual messages. And yeah, there will be more things to come. So recognizing the patterns, recognizing that I was still holding on to a version of myself that was responsible to my family, was responsible to achieve certain things for and within and because of my family, and committing to that more than I was committing to my core self, my healed self, my liberated self. You follow me? Recognizing that I myself was holding on to a version, a possibility that was actually harmful to me, as opposed to the version and the possibility that liberates me. Real simple, right? Like, the more I noticed the harmful identity, the harmful version, the more I interrogated that, the more I was able to see what the healed version looks like, what the liberated version of me looks like, right? For you to embody your liberated core self coming out of empire, coming out of the narcissistic abuse that embeds itself at the cellular level. Because let's keep it a stat. Tiger mom parenting is a form of, it has elements, many elements of narcissistic abuse, because it's just a reflection of the imperial model of parenting. It's the same way that the empire parents us, the empire guides us as collective beings. That's the same thing that we bring into the family. It's normal, it's natural, it's what's in the media, it's what's in the news, it's what's in the education, it's what's in the culture and the social experience, right? So um, when we look at the narcissistic abuse at the cellular level, at the emotional level, at the heart level, as I was doing, we're then able to see more of the liberated version. Like, what is the version of you that is not experiencing narcissistic abuse, right? What is the version of you that if that narcissistic abuse had no effect on you, who would you be, right? How would you be? How would you move and operate in the world? Um, and when you can pay enough attention to that, then you get the clues and the insights and the guidance for how to embody and exemplify this liberated core self, this liberated version of you. Am I making sense? I hope I'm landing for y'all. Light is the New Black is looking at me. I'm gonna have to read a page from that, and maybe um, the Glass Bead Game as well. But this coming back to like being a shaman, being a techie shaman, being a healer, and recognizing the journey that helped me get to this recognition of myself, right? Self recognition. Coming home to yourself is about self recognition. It's about helping you to see who you are, who you've always been at your core, who your liberated self has always been. It's not about crafting a new identity necessarily. That might be a step early in the process before you can even get close to seeing who you are. But self recognition means I spent enough time with myself. I paid enough attention to myself that I was able to recognize, see, appreciate who I am under all the layers of empire, under all the layers of narcissistic abuse, under all the layers of programming that tell me that my core self isn't good enough. Under all those layers, who am I? Who was I? Who will I be eternally? That is what liberation from within looks like. That is what rebuilding the Black self after empire looks like, because you then get to pay more attention to that person. And attention is energy, attention is fuel, attention is power. The more attention you pay to that liberated core self, the more she blossoms, the more she expands, the more she magnetizes those who are her people, those who are meant to be a blessing to her, those who can empower her, those who will fuel her, strengthen her, celebrate her, embrace her, because they are simply a reflection of your recognition of yourself. So you recognize yourself. That makes you recognizable to the people who themselves can recognize you, are meant to recognize you, are wired to recognize you. So I shifted from aspiring to the identity that would keep me in bondage. And this is really deep work because it's very, very subconscious if you don't pay attention to it. The identity that would have kept me in bondage to the aspiration of external approval, external acceptance, external recognition from my family, from my community, from the environment, from the society, shifted from that to the version of myself that is already who I am and is free in that and is celebrating that and is appreciative of that. And that is a huge step for me personally. So one of the big revelations last week that helped me get to that was beginning to keep my Yoruba diary. So if you're my Spill fam, if you've been with me on Spill, if you subscribe to Soul Medicine Substack, um, yes, I'm looking forward to sharing some of the diaries with you. I have been recording a lot of them. Some of them are just going to get uploaded as whole recordings. Some of them will get chopped. It's a process, but honestly, I realize, considering this idea that the opposite of depression is expression, I realized that there were things that I needed to express that couldn't be said in English, couldn't be written, couldn't be sung. I had to like understand them. I had to express them. I had to like transmute them. I had to alchemize them through my indigenous original tongue, which is Yoruba. So keeping my Yoruba diary, oh my goodness. It's been good. It's been good for my heart, for my soul, my body, my being, my physiology, all of the good stuff. So I recommend to you, if you are a Yoruba girl found, Yoruba girl lost, Yoruba girl searching, if you are Yoruba, any gender, if you are Nigerian, African, if you have experienced the displacement of migration, displacement of language loss, the displacement of intergenerational cultural gaps because you grew up in a different culture from your parents, highly, highly, highly recommend expression as the opposite of whatever is sort of suppressed or repressed or depressed in your life, right? Express yourself. And if your language was originally, if the language that you spoke from ages, from 0 to 5, from birth to 5, if it was your indigenous language, please, please find your way back to your indigenous language. It will unlock so much for you, so much truth, I promise you. Spend time, watch the films, listen to the music, allow it to just seep into your subconscious just by hearing it. If you're a Yoruba learner, Yoruba speaker, highly, highly recommend everything by Kunle Afolayan, especially Anikulapo. He has a way of elevating the culture, elevating the language, presenting the highest beauty of our language and culture. And so I just highly recommend that you immerse in his work and appreciate the teachings that come across through his characters, through the writing, through the visuals. It's truly medicine. It's immersive medicine, medicine for the soul. So that being said, I will be back soon. If you want to do watch parties with me, I have a lot of show recordings, reaction recordings that I haven't shared yet because I want to really build this film and TV reaction experience with community. I would love to watch things with y'all and analyze them and talk about them. And again, thinking about film as spiritual medicine, film as spiritual tools, film as physiological, healing medicine. If we look at the diagnoses from a Frantz Fanon, W.E.B. Du Bois, other Black psychologists standpoint, if we look at the diagnoses around, Black split consciousness, psychoses, self-harm, all of these things, how do we term or how do we understand the healing modalities, right? If we know the diagnoses, then what are the cures? What is the language around the cures? What are the sort of steps for using and applying the cures and the cocktails, whether they are emotional, spiritual cocktails, or they are like herbal, medicinal, all of the things, right? So these are the things that I want to really dig into. If you're on Threads, join me on Threads at Soul Medicine Sanctuary. Instagram is at Soul Medicine Sanctuary. Primarily, you're going to see my stories there. And Yeah, soulmedicinesanctuary.substack.com. Again, portalx.space. I am on LinkedIn if you really want to look at the like institutional side of all of these downloads. I'll be sharing more on there about that. And so my name on LinkedIn is Olori Lolade Shiambola. Olori Lolade Skin the Monies, right? It's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed this time with y'all. I hope that you got something good from what I'm putting down. If you have questions, I'd love to hear from you. If you are thinking similar thoughts, if you're doing similar work, if you have literature to recommend, all of it I welcome. I appreciate your love, your attention, your support. Thank you for all of the likes, for sharing the content. Yeah, and just for engaging. It's really great to see you here and to be in this conversation with you. All right. Blessed love, Black sacred futures, Black liberation from within is all we desire, all we deserve.